In the winter of 1959, a network of Soviet intelligence officers operating across Western Europe began to vanish, not defecting, not dying, but simply ceasing to exist as though they had never been born. The disappearances traced back to a single directive issued from the KGB's most secretive directorate, a unit buried so deep within the Lubyanka's bureaucratic labyrinth that even senior Politburo members were denied knowledge of its operations. What kind of apparatus could erase its own people so completely that Allied intelligence agencies spent decades searching for ghosts? And what was so dangerous about their mission that the KGB considered these agents more expendable than the secrets they carried? To understand the answer, you have to go back to 1954, the year everything changed inside Soviet intelligence. Stalin was dead. Lavrenti Beria, the feared head of the NKVD and its successor agencies, had been arrested, tried in secret, and executed, a bullet to the forehead in a bunker beneath Moscow's military district headquarters. The intelligence services were in chaos. Decades of paranoia, purges, and internal betrayals had hollowed out the Soviet Union's espionage capabilities at the exact moment the Cold War was accelerating into its most dangerous phase. NATO was consolidating. The United States had tested its first hydrogen bomb. West Germany was rearming. And inside the Kremlin, the new Soviet leadership under Nikita Khrushchev understood something terrifying. The intelligence apparatus they had inherited was broken, bloated, and riddled with the scar tissue of Stalinist terror. They needed something new, something sharper, something that could operate in the shadows of Western democracies without the bureaucratic baggage that had compromised so many operations before. The answer was a restructuring so radical that it effectively created a new intelligence agency within the KGB itself. In March 1954, the Committee for State Security, the KGB, was formally established under Ivan Surov, but within its sprawling architecture, one directorate would acquire a reputation that made even hardened intelligence professionals uneasy. It was called Directorate S, and its mission was deceptively simple: to recruit, train, deploy, and manage illegal intelligence officers, agents who would live abroad under entirely fabricated identities, with no diplomatic cover, no embassy protection, and no official connection to the Soviet Union whatsoever. If they were caught, Moscow would deny their existence. If they failed, they would disappear. And if they succeeded, they would become the most valuable assets the Soviet Union possessed. But Directorate S was not what made the KGB's most feared operation so devastating. That distinction belongs to a program that grew out of Directorate S's infrastructure, but operated with an autonomy and ruthlessness that went far beyond intelligence gathering. It was known internally by several names over the decades, but Western intelligence agencies eventually came to call it by the designation that captured its essence: Operation Smersh II, a quiet resurrection of the wartime counterintelligence doctrine that had hunted Nazi collaborators and Soviet traitors with lethal efficiency. Except this time, the targets were not enemy soldiers. They were defectors, dissidents, émigré leaders, and anyone the Kremlin deemed an existential threat to the Soviet project, and the method was assassination. If you find yourself drawn to understanding the hidden mechanics that shaped the Cold War, the decisions made in windowless rooms that altered the fates of millions, then this channel exists for exactly that purpose. By subscribing, you join a community dedicated to uncovering these buried histories before they fade from collective memory entirely. Consider it an investment in understanding how power truly operates. Now, the KGB's assassination capabilities did not emerge from nothing. They were inherited from a long and bloody tradition. As early as the 1930s, Stalin's secret police had carried out targeted killings abroad. The most infamous was the murder of Leon Trotsky in Mexico City in 1940, when NKVD agent Ramon Mercader drove an ice axe into Trotsky's skull in his own study. But the post-war era demanded a different approach. The clumsy, violent methods of the Stalinist period, poisoned candy boxes, blunt force attacks, agents who were often caught, had to be refined. The KGB needed kills that looked natural: heart attacks, suicides, accidents, and for the cases where a message needed to be sent, they needed methods so exotic that Western forensic science could not identify the cause of death. This is where the story takes its darkest turn, and where a single name becomes central to everything that followed. That name is Pavel Sudoplatov, a Ukrainian-born intelligence officer who had personally assassinated the leader of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, Yevhen Konovalets, with a disguised bomb in Rotterdam in 1938. Sudoplatov was the architect of Soviet assassination doctrine. He had run the NKVD's Administration for Special Tasks during World War II, overseeing sabotage operations behind German lines and coordinating the liquidation of perceived enemies of the state across multiple continents. After the war, Sudoplatov was imprisoned during the post-Beria purges, spending 15 years in Vladimir prison. But his methods, his philosophy of targeted elimination as a tool of statecraft, survived him. They were codified, refined, and passed down through the institutional memory of the KGB, like a virus embedded in its organizational DNA. By the mid-1950s, the KGB had established a dedicated unit for what it euphemistically called wet affairs, mokroye delo in Russian, a term that referred to operations involving bloodshed. This unit was designated Department 13 of the First Chief Directorate, and later reorganized as Department V, and still later as Directorate K. The naming conventions shifted with each bureaucratic reorganization, a deliberate strategy to confuse Western intelligence analysts trying to map the KGB's internal structure. But the mission remained constant: identify targets designated for elimination by the Soviet leadership, develop operational plans, select and train operatives, acquire or develop specialized weapons, and execute the operation with maximum deniability. The weapons themselves deserve attention because they reveal the extraordinary lengths to which the KGB went to make death invisible. In 1957, a KGB defector named Nikolai Koklov appeared before a stunned American press conference and revealed that he had been sent to assassinate Georgi Markov, a leader of the anti-Soviet émigré organization NTS in Frankfurt, West Germany. Koklov's assigned weapon was a miniature electrically operated gun disguised inside a cigarette case designed to fire cyanide-tipped bullets. The bullets were so small dum-dum rounds no larger than a pencil eraser that they would fragment inside the body, making ballistic analysis nearly impossible. Koklov had refused to carry out the mission and defected instead. His reward for this act of conscience was swift. In 1957, at a conference in Frankfurt, Koklov became violently ill. He was rushed to a US military hospital, where doctors discovered he had been poisoned with radioactive thallium. His hair fell out, his skin cracked and bled. His blood turned to plasma. American doctors managed to save his life, but barely, and only because they happened to have access to experimental treatments. The message was clear: the KGB could reach you anywhere, and even defection was not an escape. But Koklov's case, dramatic as it was merely prologue. The operation that would become the KGB's most feared, the one that demonstrated the full, terrifying scope of its capabilities, centered on a man named Stepan Bandera, and the weapon used to kill him was something out of a science fiction novel. Stepan Bandera was the leader of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, a fiercely anti-Soviet movement that had fought for Ukrainian independence since the 1930s. Bandera was a polarizing figure revered by Ukrainian nationalists as a freedom fighter, condemned by the Soviets as a fascist collaborator who had worked with Nazi Germany during World War II. The historical reality, as is often the case, was more complicated than either narrative allowed. But for the KGB, the nuances were irrelevant. Bandera was living in Munich, West Germany, under the protection of Western intelligence agencies, and he was actively coordinating resistance networks inside Soviet Ukraine. He was a symbol, a rallying point, and in the Kremlin's calculus, he was a threat that could not be tolerated. The man selected to eliminate Bandera was a KGB officer named Bohdan Stashinsky, a young Ukrainian recruited by Soviet intelligence, while still a teenager. Stashinsky's recruitment followed a pattern that the KGB had perfected over decades: identify a vulnerable individual, apply pressure through a combination of ideological persuasion and personal coercion, then gradually escalate their involvement until retreat becomes impossible. In Stashinsky's case, the leverage was his family. His relatives in Soviet Ukraine were threatened with reprisals if he refused to cooperate. By the time he was assigned to Department 13, Stashinsky had been transformed from a frightened young man into a trained killer, though the fear never left him. Stashinsky's first major assignment came in 1957, when he was ordered to assassinate Lev Rebet, a Ukrainian émigré intellectual and political theorist living in Munich. The weapon provided to Stashinsky was unlike anything Western intelligence had encountered: a specially engineered spray gun, roughly the size of a small flashlight, that fired a jet of prussic acid, liquid hydrogen cyanide, directly into the victim's face. The device was designed so that the cyanide would be inhaled, causing almost instantaneous cardiac arrest. The beauty of the weapon, from the KGB's perspective, was forensic invisibility. Hydrogen cyanide dissipates rapidly from the body after death, unless a pathologist specifically tested for it, and in the late 1950s, few routinely did. The cause of death would appear to be a simple heart attack. No bullet wounds, no stab marks, no poison residue that standard toxicology screens would detect. On October 12, 1957, Stashinsky followed Rebet into the stairwell of an office building at Karlsplatz 8 in Munich. The stairwell was narrow, dimly lit, the walls close enough to echo every footstep. Stashinsky waited until Rebet was climbing the stairs ahead of him, then activated the spray gun at close range. A fine mist of prussic acid hit Rebet in the face. The émigré leader staggered, collapsed on the stairs, and died within minutes. Stashinsky walked out of the building, crushed an ampoule of amyl nitrate, the antidote, under his own nose to counteract any residual cyanide he might have inhaled, and disappeared into the Munich streets. The German autopsy concluded that Rebet had died of natural causes. Heart failure, no foul play suspected. The KGB's weapon had worked perfectly. What followed was a period of waiting and then escalation. Stashinsky was recalled to Moscow, debriefed and congratulated. But the success of the Rebet operation had emboldened the KGB leadership. If one émigré leader could be eliminated without detection, then the most important target of all was now within reach. The order came from the highest levels. Sources differ on whether it originated directly from Khrushchev or from KGB chairman Alexander Shelepin, but the authorization was unambiguous. Stepan Bandera was to be liquidated. Stashinsky spent months preparing. He traveled to Munich multiple times under false identities, studying Bandera's routines, his apartment building at Kreitmayerstrasse 7, his habits, the layout of the entrance hall. The KGB provided an upgraded version of the spray gun, this time a double-barreled model, ensuring a more concentrated dose of prussic acid. Stashinsky practiced with the weapon. He memorized escape routes. He prepared his documentation for border crossings. Every detail was planned with the meticulous precision that characterized the KGB's most critical operations. On October 15, 1959, Stashinsky made his move. It was a Thursday. Munich was gray and cold, the kind of autumn day when people hurried through the streets with their collars turned up and their eyes on the pavement. Stashinsky entered Bandera's apartment building and waited in the entrance hall. He had wrapped the spray gun in newspaper, holding it as though it were a package. When Bandera entered the building, carrying a bag of groceries, Stashinsky activated the device. The double blast of prussic acid struck Bandera directly in the face. Bandera gasped, staggered backward, and collapsed. Stashinsky fled the building, again using the amyl nitrate antidote on himself, and within hours was on his way back to East Germany. Bandera was found dead on the landing of his apartment building, his face bearing the bluish discoloration characteristic of cyanide poisoning. But here is where the German authorities made a crucial error, or perhaps it was not an error at all. The initial autopsy attributed Bandera's death to cyanide poisoning, but the finding was controversial. Some investigators believed it was suicide. Others suspected foul play, but could not identify a delivery mechanism. The case lingered, unresolved, in the files of the Munich police. And then, in 1961, the entire operation unraveled because of something the KGB had not anticipated. Bohdan Stashinsky fell in love. His wife, Inge Pohl, was an East German woman who gradually became aware of the true nature of her husband's work. The weight of what Stashinsky had done, 2 murders, carried out in cold blood on the orders of a state he was beginning to doubt, combined with Inge's moral horror at the revelations, created an unbearable pressure. When the couple's infant son died in unclear circumstances in 1961, Stashinsky reached a breaking point. On August 12, 1961, the very day before the Berlin Wall began to go up, Stashinsky and his wife crossed from East Berlin to West Berlin and surrendered to American authorities. The timing was extraordinary. One day later, an escape would have been physically impossible. The wall would have sealed them in. Whether Stashinsky knew about the impending border closure, whether he had intelligence about the wall's construction that accelerated his decision, remains one of the unresolved questions of this story. Records are incomplete. What is certain is that his defection opened a floodgate of intelligence that shocked Western governments and exposed the full scope of the KGB's assassination program. Stashinsky's confession was meticulous. He described the weapons, the training, the operational planning, the chain of command, and the specific orders he had received. He identified his handlers. He explained the forensic logic behind the prussic acid spray gun, how it was designed to defeat Western autopsy procedures. His testimony led to the landmark trial in Karlsruhe, West Germany, in October 1962, which became one of the most significant espionage cases of the Cold War. The German Federal Court of Justice convicted Stashinsky of 2 counts of murder, but, in a remarkable legal decision, sentenced him to only 8 years in prison. The court's reasoning was groundbreaking. It held that the primary guilt lay not with Stashinsky, the triggerman, but with the Soviet government officials who had ordered the killings. Stashinsky was classified as an accomplice, not a principal perpetrator. The court explicitly named Alexander Shelepin, the chairman of the KGB, as the true murderer, a judgment that sent shockwaves through the Soviet intelligence establishment. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. The Stashinsky trial forced a fundamental reorganization of the KGB's assassination capabilities. Department 13 was disbanded and reconstituted under new management. The political fallout contributed to Shelepin's eventual fall from power. More importantly, the trial established a public record, available to journalists, historians, and intelligence analysts worldwide, of how the KGB conducted targeted killings abroad. The spray gun, the prussic acid, the false identities, the meticulous surveillance, the escape routes, the antidotes, all of it was now on the record. The KGB's most closely guarded operational methods had been exposed in open court. But here is the pattern interrupt that makes this story resonate beyond its immediate historical context. The KGB did not stop. The exposure of its methods did not end the practice of state-sponsored assassination, it merely forced an evolution. The weapons changed, the organizational structures were renamed, the operational security was tightened, but the doctrine, the belief that the Soviet state had the right and the capability to reach across borders and eliminate individuals deemed threats to its survival, persisted for decades. In 1978, Bulgarian dissident Georgi Markov was killed on Waterloo Bridge in London when an umbrella-tipped weapon injected a tiny ricin-filled pellet into his leg. The Bulgarian Secret Service, the DS, carried out the operation, but the technology came from the KGB. The method was different. The principle was identical. Consider the statistics for a moment. According to declassified records and the testimonies of defectors compiled by researchers like Christopher Andrew and Vasily Mitrokhin, the KGB and its predecessor agencies carried out or attempted at least several dozen targeted assassinations abroad between the 1930s and the 1980s. The true number is almost certainly higher. Many operations were designed to be undetectable, and for those that succeeded in that goal, we may never have a complete accounting. Each operation required months or years of preparation, involved multiple support agents, and consumed significant resources. The Soviet state treated assassination as a legitimate instrument of policy, governed by its own internal approval process, with kill orders sometimes requiring authorization from the General Secretary of the Communist Party himself. Stashinsky, meanwhile, served his 8-year sentence and was released in 1966. What happened to him after that is one of the Cold War's most persistent mysteries. He was given a new identity by West German intelligence and disappeared into the anonymity of civilian life. Some reports placed him in South Africa, others suggested he relocated to the United States or remained in Western Europe under deep cover. The KGB, humiliated by his defection and the trial that followed, reportedly placed a standing order for his elimination, a bitter irony given that Stashinsky had been their own instrument of death. Whether they ever found him is unknown. As of the most recent credible reporting, Stashinsky's fate remains unconfirmed, his location undisclosed, his identity presumably changed multiple times. He is a man who lived as a ghost even before he became one. The legacy of the KGB's assassination program extends into the present in ways that are impossible to ignore. The methods have evolved nerve agents like Novichok radioactive polonium-210, sophisticated poisonings that leave forensic signatures but carry an implicit message of state power, but the operational philosophy remains recognizable. In 2006, former FSB officer Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned with polonium-210 in London, dying an agonizing death over 3 weeks as his organs failed one by one. In 2018, former GRU officer Sergei Skripal and his daughter were poisoned with the Novichok nerve agent in Salisbury, England, in an attack that also endangered dozens of bystanders and killed a British citizen who accidentally encountered the discarded poison container. In both cases, the operational fingerprints, the exotic poison, the state authorization, the implicit deniability paired with implicit attribution, echoed the methods pioneered by Department 13 6 decades earlier. What Stashinsky's story reveals more than anything is the machinery of complicity. The KGB's most feared operation was not a single mission or a single weapon. It was a system, a bureaucratic, institutional system designed to transform ordinary human beings into instruments of state murder and to insulate the decision makers from the consequences of their orders. Stashinsky was recruited as a teenager, trained through a process that systematically eroded his moral autonomy, given weapons that distanced him psychologically from the act of killing. A spray gun is not a knife. You do not feel the victim's body resist and then discarded when he was no longer useful. The men who ordered the killings, Shelepin, Khrushchev, the faceless bureaucrats who drafted the operational plans, never saw the stairwell at Karlsplatz 8, never smelled the prussic acid, never watched a man collapse with groceries scattering across a Munich hallway floor. They signed papers, they attended meetings, they went home to their families in their Moscow apartments, ate dinner, and slept soundly. The system was designed to make murder administrative, and this is perhaps the most unsettling lesson of this history. The KGB's most feared operation was feared not because of its violence. Violence is common in the annals of intelligence history, but because of its efficiency, its deniability, and its institutional permanence. It was a capability that survived leadership changes, political thaws, organizational restructurings, and even the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. The men who built it understood something fundamental about power, that the ability to reach across borders and extinguish a human life, quietly, invisibly, and without consequence, is the ultimate expression of state authority. It is a capability that, once created, is never willingly surrendered. The spray gun that killed Stepan Bandera is now in a museum. The stairwell where Lev Rebet died has been renovated. The Berlin Wall that almost trapped Stashinsky has been reduced to souvenir fragments sold to tourists. But the doctrine that made all of it possible, the belief that a state can designate individuals for death and dispatch trained operatives to carry out the sentence, did not end when the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time on December 25, 1991. It adapted. It migrated into new institutions, acquired new chemical formulas, adopted new cover stories, and it continues to operate in a world where the boundary between statecraft and murder remains as thin and as lethal as a mist of prussic acid in a Munich stairwell on an October afternoon.